The portrait looks ordinary until the second look, and then nothing about it feels safe anymore. A late summer family sits on stone steps, posed in perfect tiers of ownership. Master at center, wife beside, children carefully arranged, the household's enslaved servants pushed into the background like furniture that breathes. It is August 14th, 1859, in Richmond, Virginia. A date caught and fixed by the shallow gleam of a daguerreotype plate made by a traveling photographer named Marcus Webb. The air in the camera dark would have tasted of chemicals and waiting. The exposure long enough for the smallest tremor to become a permanent rumor in silver. One woman, tall, mid-30s, composed beyond endurance, turns her face a fraction off the axis dictated by the master's gaze. In her right hand, partly hidden by the folds of a dark dress, she holds a piece of paper folded too precisely to be accident. The line of her fingers is tense, decisive. She is not supposed to be holding anything at all. She is holding a secret. The photograph arrives decades later in a climate-controlled archive at the Virginia Historical Society, wrapped without ceremony, as if the past could be mailed. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who has built a life on calming her breath in front of artifacts, tilts a magnifier and leans into that hidden plane, the between space where intention leaves fingerprints on light. She has seen hundreds of plantation portraits. She can date them by hair, hem, hinge, by how a planter's thumb asserts ownership in the drape of a child's shoulder. But enslaved hands are always empty in these pictures, by design. The tableau is propaganda, wealth staged as natural order. The hand here is not empty. Sarah's pulse steps across an invisible threshold. The paper is real, not a flaw in the plate, not a trick of reflection. The quiet sentence forms in her mouth before she knows she is speaking. This changes everything. Outside, Richmond moans with summer heat, but the archive is the season of kept things. Ledgers, letters, inventories, all the ways power writes itself down. Names of the enslaved are scarce in such pages, and when present, they are surrounded by numbers, ages, valuations, provisions, until a person feels like an arithmetic problem, set by someone who will never be graded. Sarah pulls threads, property records that name Jonathan Ashford, a plantation called Riverside Manor, 47 enslaved workers in the year of the photograph, a respectable church pew at St. John's, the municipal gravity of a city council seat. The photographer's ledger confirms the date. Webb's other plates, viewed in series, reveal a grammar of posture in which black bodies are placed as proofs of someone else's prosperity. And yet this one hand, this one paper, interrupts the sentence. She calls Marcus Reynolds, who has made a study of the ways people whisper inside systems designed to make them silent. He comes quickly, old curiosity lending him the speed of a younger man. He does not waste time on denial. "That's deliberate," he says, glasses nudged higher, the way a craftsman prepares for fine work. The angle, the grip, the tension, all chosen. Who is she? The question opens like a trapdoor into a shaft of unrecorded lives. The 1860 slave schedule offers only the outline of 7 women of indeterminate names working in the main house. But the woman in the picture has a face that rewrites the lack. Her gaze is a line thrown across time, a demand that someone step up and take it. Across town, the Richmond Museum of the Confederacy keeps the detritus of the Ashford family's certainty. Account books, supply orders, legal correspondences, the daily mechanics of turning bodies into yield. In a letter dated September 1859, a month after the portrait, Jonathan writes of troubling incidents and peculiar behavior among house servants, the kind of phrasing that suggests the ground under a planter's boots, has acquired the idea of movement. He increases supervision. He curtails movement. He speaks the language of a man rearranging furniture to stop a draft. Then in accounting. October. 3 women sold south to New Orleans. A punishment disguised as a market decision. The price hurried and slightly below the going rate. Urgency bleeding into arithmetic. Sarah's path crosses the living descendant of the Ashford line, a woman named Elizabeth, who has outlived illusions and chosen conscience. She has the kind of parlor that accumulates in families that survive the wreckage of their own fictions. Photographs turned to sepia, not by choice, but by air. Velvet chairs that keep the shape of conversations long over. Elizabeth studies the portrait and softly says she has never seen it. Her grandfather destroyed most images from the plantation years, an attempt to solve a moral problem by managing the evidence. She remembers a name, though, pulled from the stubborn sediments of whispered family stories. Clara. Educated in secret, taught herself to read with stolen books, sold south when discovered. The room tips slightly. A journal emerges, Margaret Ashford's, its brief domestic entries the quiet records of a house. August, a portrait. A woman named Clara holding herself with unusual tension. September. Clara sold, along with Ruth and Diane, corrupted by ideas that made them dangerous. Beneath the diction, fear hisses like steam. The Underground Railroad is a phrase that risks smoothing what was jagged. The choices, the terror, the brilliance of improvisation. In mid-1859, Virginia is a powder magazine with a lit fuse. Harper's Ferry is 2 months away, but planning and rumor travel in the same corridors as food and gossip. Networks in Richmond are not abstractions. They are people, free black carpenters, Quaker seamstresses, immigrants at the river's edge, those who pass as expected, and those whom no one expects to pass at all. The paper in Clara's hand could be gossip, a list, a prayer, a map, a name. What matters is that she chose to put it in the picture. A formal family portrait is the least suspicious place, and therefore the best hiding place, because no one will examine enslaved hands for content in a scene designed to erase their contents. Technology, centuries unborn at the time of exposure, returns to interrogate the silver. In a digital humanities lab, a specialist steadies the plate under multispectral lights, and the past answers in wavelengths. The paper brightens under certain bands. Texture becomes topography. Indentations, uncertain but insistent, suggest marks that could be writing, or a sketch, or both. A star-like symbol flickers, and Marcus murmurs the code he has learned to hear in such shapes. Safe house, contact, turn here. The edges of initials begin to separate from noise, clusters that might be JWMCRL. The dangerous thrill is not what can be proven in a courtroom, but what can be followed like a path through a field at night by someone who has walked it before. The name Clara is a ladder. New Orleans receives people as a market receives stock, and yet in the paperwork of commodification, the human insists. A notary's script notes 3 women in late October, aligned in numerals, 34, 28, 41. One with unusual scarring on her hands, consistent with burns, a phrase that tries to reduce what fire means. Burns like the cost of touching forbidden materials. Books, letters, ink. The buyer is a sugar planter in St. James Parish, farther south not just in latitude but in the density of control. 6 months later, a report lists an escape. An intelligent woman, literate, dangerous. The absence of follow-up is its own kind of presence. Silence can mean disappearance. It can also mean success, refined into hush. The northward routes from the Gulf region splinter like river deltas in reverse, thin paths finding each other toward free soil. In an Iowa station's coded journal, a Quaker conductor writes of 3 travelers from the Gulf, 2 men and a woman whose knowledge and resolve are unusual. She speaks of Virginia, of unfinished business, the phrase that turns survival into responsibility. A letter to Philadelphia mentions a woman from Richmond circles, whose intelligence is an instrument, whose memory is a ledger, whose desire to return is tempered by an understanding of stakes that cannot be written down, without endangering those still in the net. The ledger entries turn initials into persons. The photograph's faint marks become people who make bread, sew hems, fix beams, open doors. Back in Richmond, the city teeters toward war, and the machinery of policing crystallizes around anxieties long present. A Confederate provost marshal takes dictation of fear in March 1861. A woman named Clara, sold from the Ashford place, rumored to have returned, suspected of aiding runaways. The pen is Jonathan's, neat as ever, complaining that she evades capture and undermines order. He names her a threat to stability, as if the order he defends were not the daily theft of time and breath. The words hold a sour admiration. What else can unusual intelligence be when written by a man who has failed to outthink her? It will be years before the city burns and the James reflects the red unmaking of a capital. In April 1865, when Richmond falls, the Union makes a camp for those who have slipped the bonds and those shaken from them by the force of events. A brief record survives. A woman approximately 40, named Clara, interviewed, claiming to have worked as a conductor in Richmond throughout the war, providing intelligence on supply routes and sympathetic households. The clerk recommends recognition in the tone of someone who knows that recognition is both too little and the only currency available. The line is short. The life it sketches is not. What the first chapter must do is set the hook and draw the line taut. Without making promises the evidence cannot keep. A hand, a folded paper, a choice caught in reflected light. The kind of choice that demands a story. The family sits in composure, the camera stares, the chemicals fix. But a woman's hand slips a map into the scene. There is a particular kind of courage in using the master's portrait to archive your own resistance, in trusting that somewhere downstream a stranger will tilt a glass over your hand and listen hard enough to hear the quiet roar of what you did. The rest of the story will follow the marks the way a conductor reads the night. By stars, by memory, by the slight shine of a thing you are not supposed to be holding. It should have been impossible. An enslaved woman holding anything in a formal plantation portrait would have violated the entire grammar of the scene, the staging, the control, the fantasy that these pictures were made to sell. That is why the paper matters, not only because it exists, but because it breaks a rule so rarely broken that its mere presence is an alarm bell disguised as a whisper. The portrait's theater, chairs, steps, symmetry, human props, was designed to pacify the eye and certify ownership, and yet her hand refuses certification. What kind of message is bold enough to hide inside someone else's propaganda and trust that silver will keep the secret until someone learns to read it? Plantation portraits worked like advertisements and alibis. The master's spine formed the central axis. The wife mirrored refinement. The children calmed the future with lace. And behind them, enslaved people stood as living commas, punctuation that made the sentence of wealth seem complete. Hands were controlled. Eyes were controlled. The camera operator, such as Marcus Webb, not only arranged bodies, but negotiated a hierarchy that the plate would teach back to the viewer. In hundreds of Webb's sittings from 1855 to 1861, background figures hold nothing. Their emptiness meant to prove they have nothing to hold. And then there is this one plate where emptiness fails on purpose. Once you understand the stagecraft, deviation is not a curiosity. It is a flare shot in daylight. Study the micro-choreography. The master sits in a chair that declares the right to sit. His wife touches the chair, borrowing his authority by fingertip. The eldest child's shoulder becomes a pedestal for lineage, and the servants behind are spaced to imply abundance without individuality. The woman with the paper violates spacing by a hair's breadth, enough to appear obedient to the untrained eye, but enough to anchor the viewer's attention where she wants it. Her body makes a hinge between the planter's show and her own subtext, a hinge that creaks only when you lean in. Who taught her that a posture could carry a message? Who taught her that a message could survive chemicals and a master's gaze? There were rules, both spoken and unspoken. No props for enslaved subjects. No forward lean that reads as intention. No hands that interrupt the master's silhouette. No lines that lead toward the back row. The theater ensured that background remained background. Yet the paper in her hand creates a diagonal from the master's knee across the plate into the dark fold, where her fingers press the secret flat. The diagonals of meaning in photographs often run where power doesn't look, and she understands this well enough to turn the portrait into a map. If the theater is meant to flatten time and choice, she reinflates both with a single fold. Mid-chapter reveal. Under multispectral light, the paper answers. Blue-violet wavelengths pry detail loose from silver's stubborn hush. Indentations rise like low tide exposing rocks. Not a full sentence, nothing so generous, but marks enough to refuse silence. A 5-point glyph appears near the edge, slightly skewed, too crisp to be accident, the kind of star symbol used in clandestine notes as an anchor. Safe house, trusted door, or rendezvous. Along the crease, initial clusters separate from noise. JW in a clenched hand, perhaps. An R that tails into L. A mark that could be 2 bars crossing like a lowercase t, or a carpenter's sign. For an underground network that relied on memory and breath, even a half symbol is a shout. If this was only vanity, why hide a coordinate in a family portrait? If it was only accident, why did the paper survive the staging rules that erased every other hand? The household's theater extended beyond the camera. Breakfast arrivals were sequenced so the master never waited. Footfalls in corridors were softened so the wife never noticed. Errands were rotated to keep the same face from passing through town too often, because regular routes invite recognition. In that choreography, house servants carried the risk and privilege of movement. Gossip passed through a silver coffee service. A hymn hummed off-key in a hallway could time-stamp a conversation through shared church habits. A spool of thread in the wrong drawer could be a breadcrumb. If you were going to embed a message in a day where every gesture was rehearsed, you would choose the moment when the house itself was performing. Because performance blinds the performers, most of all. The photographer's ledger gives the date and fee, but the plate gives the risk. Exposure times demanded stillness that punished tremor. Any tremor writes itself as blur, and blur reads as failure. Her hand, though, is steady. This is not the grip of panic. It is the grip of decision. One more rule broken. Enslaved women in plates are supposed to melt into the structure of somebody else's day. Instead, she composes a message inside the composition. If a portrait is a contract with the future, this was our house. These were our people. She drafts a counter-contract. This was my hand, and this is what it carried. Ask yourself why the master paid for the evidence that undermines him. Ask yourself who inside his house had learned to make his money do her work. End scene hook. A second, sharper detail surfaces beneath the star. 2 short strokes beside a longer one. It could be nothing. It could be a code fragment for a corner where the alley meets the churchyard wall, or the number of doors to knock before the right one opens. The theater of the portrait collapses into logistics. Where to wait, when to move, who to trust. If the star is a place, then the strokes are a clock. If the initials are names, then the picture is a roster disguised as family pride. What if the safest place to hide a map is in a master's most public lie? There is a reason the sale followed quickly. The planter's letter in September uses the vocabulary of furniture, arrangements, movements, supervision, because to admit what is really moving would mean acknowledging an intelligence running against the grain of his house. In the theater, dissent is not a speech. It is a misfolded napkin at dinner, a door left on the first latch instead of the second, a hand that shouldn't be holding paper in a portrait. The rushed, below-market sale 1 month later reads as a stagehand yanking the curtain down when the scene goes wrong. But even that choice belongs to the logic of performance. If the play fails here, move the actors south and pretend the script still holds. The paper insists the script never held. So how did the rule break survive the photographer? Webb was efficient, but efficiency is a habit that can be recruited. He looks at the paying faces. He watches the master's line. He worries about glare on the wife's brooch. He waits for the child to stop blinking. He does not watch the back row as if it could act. The servant knows this. She gives him what he expects everywhere except the fold of her hand. If he saw it, he could have told her to drop it. If the master saw it, he could have ordered it removed. Neither did, or neither cared in the moment, because the theater had taught them that the background can't become a plot. She knows better. She bets on their blindness. She wins by inches. For viewers today, the portrait still tries its old trick. At first glance, it throws wealth at you. Porch columns, pleated dresses, a boy's stiff collar. But once the paper is seen, the image inverts. Every detail rearranges itself around that hand. The wife's averted gaze becomes avoidance, not poise. The master's calm becomes brittle. The servants cease to be plural and become a room of individuals with lines the script forgot to assign. The theater is exposed as a machine that misfires when one person refuses a cue. That refusal is the shock, not because it is loud, but because it is precise. Precision is how you smuggle a life through a room that will punish you for having one. Promise of what's next. To understand the paper, the star, the initials, and the clock strokes, the stagecraft must be reversed. Every rule named, every cue decoded, every line of sight mapped from chair to step to back row. Someone taught Clara the geometry of escape and the grammar of appearing harmless while being anything but. Next comes the unmasking of how that grammar worked in parlor and pantry, in church and market, and how a photograph's false stillness can be broken into moving parts. paths through Richmond, doors that open at dusk, a note that fits under a fingernail and still changes the fate of a house. The theater had its rules. She used them to write a different play. Curtain up. Begin with the absence, because that is how the archive speaks about her. The ledger calls her female house. The census dissolves her into a tally, and the planter's September letter reduces her to a problem of supervision and arrangement. Yet the portrait refuses to honor that erasure. A face angled from the axis, a hand that will not be empty, a paper folded, like intent. If the first chapter found the note, and the second decoded the theater that let it exist, this chapter must restore a person where the record tried to place only a function. The name Clara surfaces in Margaret Ashford's private journal with the quiet of guilt. And even if journals lie, they lie in ways that reveal what the liar fears. Guilt, fear, a name, and a hand that will not unclench. That is enough to start calling her back into view. Every plantation had a grammar of work that contained and occasionally created a grammar of resistance. In the main house, education was contraband more dangerous than a knife. Books cut quickly and invisibly. The journal entry that notes Clara's unusual tension on the day of the portrait is housekeeping language, but it trembles at the edges, as if the writer has touched a live wire and is choosing not to name the shock. A second entry, weeks later, calls Clara corrupted by ideas and orders her souled south. That word, corrupted, is the planter's best attempt at describing literacy without saying it, at describing intent without granting her agency. The house can choreograph breakfast. It cannot choreograph a woman's decision to become more than her assigned role. If the archive is stingy with names, it is generous with patterns. The pattern around Clara is the pattern of a mind using small liberties as levers. A house servant can move between rooms, a trusted hand can be sent to market, a careful face can listen while appearing to hum a hymn. The Underground Railroad as a living network required these micro-passages, not just the famous midnight dashes across state lines. A woman who learns to read in stolen minutes also learns to count doors and faces, to carry routes in memory, to turn the house's schedule into a shield. The folded note in the portrait is consistent with that skill set. A coordinate disguised as compliance. The fact that she chooses to anchor the message in an image meant to erase her is not an accident. It is a strategy perfected by living in the crosshairs of someone else's narrative. Consider the sale that follows, quick and below market, as a confession the planter did not intend to make. Panic has its own penmanship. If Clara's literacy was discovered, the house would interpret it as theft, of time, of obedience, of hierarchy. Selling her south to New Orleans converts threat into cash, but hurried arithmetic leaves fingerprints. The valuation is slightly off, the justifications are euphemisms. The transaction also tells on itself by grouping her with two others, Ruth and Diane, both domestic, both accused of being led astray. This is how networks look to those who cannot imagine women as strategists, not like a plan, but like a contagion. The portrait sits upstream of this decision like a bright stone in shallow water. Once noticed, you cannot claim the crossing was ever uncomplicated. Shock arrives not as spectacle, but as a ledger line. The New Orleans notary lists distinguishing marks: height, complexion, scars. For one woman, likely Clara, burns on hands consistent with contact with heated metal and ink. The phrase is meant as identification, not narrative. It becomes narrative anyway. Heated metal belongs to kitchens and print shops. Ink belongs to books and letters. If those burns came from teaching herself to read by candle, or from smoothing a page too close to a stove to hide it when footsteps approached, then the scars are a syllabus written on skin. In a world that insists you remain illiterate, the price of reading will sometimes be pain, and the archive will memorialize it by accident, trying to make sure no one sells you twice under the wrong name. The multispectral analysis of the note does not give a full sentence, but it gives a grammar, a 5-point star, initials that cluster, tick marks that imply sequence. Marcus, cautious by habit, refuses certainty, but allows direction. A star could mean a safe house or a church door. Initials could be the sender or the contact. Ticks could be a number of houses to pass or hours to wait. The point here is not to claim a decipherment that cannot be proven. It is to show that the note behaves like other clandestine notes used by networks that had to assume interception. The safest message is the one that tells the reader only what they already know how to use. Confirmation, not instruction. A nudge, not a map. The fact of its presence in the portrait is louder than any word it might contain. Return to Richmond after the sale, because disappearance is not the end of agency. Months later, a report of an escape from St. James Parish lists an intelligent woman, literate, dangerous. Dangerous is the enslaver's word for someone who has discovered the leverage points of a system and begun to press. The subsequent silence can read as failure or as a success refined into quiet. Then the rumor. A woman resembling Clara seen in Richmond again, the city's provost later describing a conductor working under cover of domestic errands. The planter, Jonathan, complains in a letter that she undermines order. That complaint admits what he cannot say. Order depends on unexamined habits, and she has learned to rearrange them. In practice, what does that rearrangement look like? Imagine the parlor where the portrait was made, now repurposed as a relay. A basket left on the wrong stair is a signal to switch routes. A hymn's second verse, hummed on a Tuesday instead of a Sunday, tags the hour to move. A particular lace collar worn to market says, "The usual stall at the edge of Shako slip is compromised." These are not romantic inventions. They are extensions of the same discipline that let her hold a note in a photograph without letting it tremble into blur. For a conductor working inside a city primed for war, the tools available are the tools at hand: fabric, food, scripture, timing. A household's props become instruments. The Plantation's theater becomes her stage. Emotional shock, precisely placed. Picture Clara reading aloud in a whisper to two other women in a pantry at midnight, running her finger just above the words so the candle soot does not mark the page. Picture the panicked gesture of thrusting the paper into her dress when footsteps scrape the hallway. Picture the next morning's portrait, where the only safe place left is to grip the sheet in plain sight and dare the camera to see her. In another room, the master writes to a broker about liquidation as if summarizing a harvest. Between those rooms, a life's trajectory is decided by who blinks first. The picture froze the moment of her refusal to blink. The sale tried to unfreeze it. It failed. To honor reality, mark the boundaries. Many of these links are reconstructed from ledgers, journals, schedules, and the plate's physical evidence. Each carries its own bias. The enslaver's pen loves euphemism. The city's records love categories. The camera loves symmetry. In the spaces between those loves, a person survives if someone in the future agrees to read against the grain. That is the work here, not to invent heroics, but to acknowledge the extraordinary precision required to be an ordinary hero, when your ordinary day is a series of traps. The paper and the burns and the sale and the rumors line up enough to illuminate a path without pretending to pave it. End of chapter. Hook. Raise the stakes with a question that demands the next step. If Clara learned to exploit the house's theater, who taught her the script? Literacy rarely blooms alone. Somewhere in Richmond is a teacher, a carpenter who leaves chalk marks under a workbench, a free black seamstress who tucks primers into hems, a Quaker who bends market conversations into lessons. Somewhere there is a first book, a first page, a first word that did not belong to the master, and from that word a road. The initials on the note, JWRL, that crossed bar like a T, could be that teacher's fingerprint. Find the teacher, and the map inside the portrait will turn from glyph to address. That is where the story goes next, into the city's rooms, where letters grow teeth, and a single folded page becomes enough to move a life. Begin with a shock the camera could never show, the sound of a door that looks closed but isn't, the first latch set, the second left loose. That is the sound of movement rehearsed as normal life, the noise of an exit hidden inside a household's routine. If the portrait hit a map, this chapter must walk it, street by street, hand to hand, turning symbols into places you could stand in, with your back against a wall and your breath measuring the dark. The star on the paper, the clustered initials, the 3 tick marks next to a longer stroke. Build a night around those marks and watch the city rearrange itself into a corridor. First, the star. In Richmond, stars are not abstractions. They live on church steeples, tavern signs, and the brass plates of shops that stay open later than they should. St. John sits high, a landmark that watches more than it prays. But a star drawn small and skewed suggests something closer to hand, less grand, more useful. A specific door on a street that never makes it into panoramic engravings. On certain corners near Shockoe Slip, a carpenter nicknamed Star John scratched a 5-point mark under lintels he repaired. As a private habit, the city forgot to notice. If Clara's network borrowed that sign, the star is not divine guidance. It is a repairman's signature, turned into a signal. This door, not that one. JW, then RL. Initials as a sequence of people, not places. 3 ticks and a long stroke. Wait 3, go on the 4th. This is how a night becomes legible. Set the route. Leave Riverside Manor through the service yard at dusk when the kitchen smoke fattens and the air eats sound. Cross the back lane where deliveries come, where faces don't matter if hands are full. Hug the fence line to the alley that swallows the view from the main road. At the 3rd gate, counted from the carriage house, not the street, pause and listen. If the watchdog barks twice, wait for the hymn from the laundry. If it doesn't, the laundry is compromised. Move. These are not decorations on a story. They are how a body survives the first 20 minutes after disobedience becomes action. Staging matters. The network does not move on heroics. It moves on errands that look like work. Clara carries an empty basket that becomes full at the star door, where JW gives her stale bread as cover, and a folded page as purpose. JW does not say names. He says, "Hurry," in a voice flat enough to sound like impatience about a late delivery. The page has only a shape, 2 crossed bars that agree with the mark on the note in the portrait. RL keeps a stall 2 streets away, selling candles and thread to wives who call her girl, and never notice her ledger's second columns. RL will light one stub if the slip is safe, two if not. This is what the ticks are for. 3 ticks, then the long. Pass 3 doors, then turn at the 4th, because the 4th has a woman who looks like a customer and knows how to become a wall if questions arrive. Mid-chapter reveal: the star matches a carpentry bill in Jonathan Ashford's account book. The entry is ordinary: hinges, planed door, repaired lintel, but the signature beneath is a tiny 5-point star next to J. Ward, a name the city directories list as a free black carpenter, with a shop near the slip. The paper in Clara's hand did not invent its symbol. It borrowed it from the planter's own repairs. A door the master paid to strengthen became a door that could be trusted at the right hour. There is no cleaner reversal. His money bought the hinge. Her note used the hinge. The archive contains this delicious irony without meaning to, the way an overconfident liar writes too much. Not every mark becomes a straight line. Routes flex with patrols, weather, mood. If a constable lingers near the slip, RL sends Clara 2 stalls farther, where a German cobbler keeps a Bible in his window. A Protestant camouflage for a dissident conscience. If a neighbor watches too hard, the sequence reverses, back to JW for a different door, then across a yard where laundry looks like surrender and is, for an hour, a shield. The code must handle noise. That is what the tick marks do. They offer options: a small branching tree cooked down to a fingernail sketch. It is not a map. It is a refusal to be trapped by a single path. Emotions drive precision. A novice would run. Clara does not run. She walks as if her day is happening to her in the usual order, stopping once to adjust a shoe, once to shift the basket's weight from a burn that flares when the handle bites. Fear is a metronome. It can either speed you up or teach you rhythm. She uses it to count doors, to time a glance, to calibrate the moment when her eyes can lift, to catch RL's candle signal, and then drop before anyone follows her gaze. The portrait trained you to look at the master. The route trains you to look at what the master never sees. That is the moral shock. Survival as the art of attention. The city adds its own choreography. On nights when river fog lays low, sound collapses into your collarbone. You cannot trust footsteps. On nights after payday, the taverns fume with stories that make patrols lazy. Market days pull strangers into streets that prefer to know every face. The route adjusts, past the cooperage when barrels are stacked like fortifications. Under the overhang where a sign painter hides solvent that singes the nose. Across the yard, where a cat's bell gives you a clock when the church's is too far. Each of these is a place you can point at, if you had permission to live in the past, long enough to stand there. The notes star and ticks are ways to hand a future reader a city that no longer exists, and tell them it did, and a life moved through it. Second reveal, placed like a blade. RL's ledger survives in fragments, and on one page the second column lists letters that do not match inventory. JW, CL, MC, RL again. Between them, a small mark. A vertical line crossed low, like a T mangled by a left-handed child. It appears in rows that correspond to dates when the city's runaway notices spike. It is a conductor's hash, the simplest possible tool that the most complex danger will permit. The same shape lives under Clara's fingers in the portrait. The echo across ink and silver is not proof in a courtroom. It is enough for a map maker of memory. The plan always includes failure, because failure is not always a moral fault, but a condition of being hunted. If the first door is dark, the code says wait 1 hour in a shadow. That looks like indecision. If the candle at RL's stall sputters, it means a patrol is moving in questions, not orders. More dangerous because curiosity bends. In that case, the route diverts to a boarding house, where an Irish widow sells soup and keeps her shutters cracked to hear the street. She will ask Clara to peel potatoes because hands that work do not look like hands that flee. If a question follows, the widow will complain about prices until the question gets bored of being answered by the cost of onions. Boredom is a tool. So is hunger. There is nothing glamorous in this. That is the point. Climax the chapter not with escape, but with a choice that turns a route into a responsibility. At the third door, J.W. is not alone. A girl of 12 waits, dressed too thin for the hour. She is not Clara's kin. She is someone else's gamble. The note did not mention her, because notes cannot hold everything without breaking. Clara knows what adding a person does to time, to noise, to risk. She looks at the star scratched into the lintel and counts the ticks in her head. The long stroke at the end is the decision to carry one more body through the dark. The route stretches like a wire pulled tight. That wire sings. If it holds, the city will never hear the music. If it snaps, the whole theater will blame the song, not the wire. End of chapter promise. Flip the lens back to the portrait. The map begin in her hand must end in the master's paperwork, because power insists on auditing what it does not understand. Jonathan's letters after the sale grow brittle with something that is not quite confession and not quite control. He complains about bread gone missing, about doors that stick, about carpenters who leave marks. He inventories losses the way weather inventories droughts, by counting what will not come back. The next chapter will pry into those papers, the provost's reports, the notices tacked to courthouse boards, and the testimonials filed in the first days of Union occupation. Somewhere in those lines, the star shows again, the initials line up, and the map drawn in a woman's folded hand resolves into a road the city tried not to see. Begin with the moment the city pretends not to hear itself. August 1859. Hums like a hive, tobacco, curing in warehouses, iron striking iron at the foundry, sermons combing the air for obedience, and yet under that hum runs a higher pitch only some ears catch. The portrait is taken, the note is held, and the stage is set, not just for a family's vanity, but for a city's test of what it will protect when the curtain shakes. 2 months from now, a federal armory will be seized at Harper's Ferry, and the South will learn to whisper the name of a man it will call mad, and a North it will call invasion. But August is quieter. August is a held breath. The question is whether a folded page in a servant's hand can be enough to puncture it. The planter makes his own weather. Jonathan writes in ledgers with the patience of a man who believes numbers will deliver him from ambiguity. Bread lost, hinges sticky, carpentry bills rising, servants moved. He is building a case to himself that the house misbehaves, not that people in it have begun to think in lines that do not end at his chair. Margaret writes in a smaller hand about church committees and hymn practice and tensions she cannot name. Between these two hands, the husband's arithmetic and the wife's euphemism, the story of a household's unraveling tries to become a domestic inconvenience. The paper in the portrait refuses that genre. It will not be a kitchen problem. It insists on being a political one. Shock, placed cold. A notice in the Richmond Dispatch announces the sale of 3 problematic domestics to be shipped south, post-haste. Their influence deemed unhealthy. The words are disease and cure in the tone of commerce. The notary records a price a fraction below the week's average, and the broker's letter betrays a haste that smells like fear. A week later, a runaway advertisement describes a literate woman using notes and signs to elude detection. The city that calls her property now admits she writes. That line is the most dangerous sentence on the page, and it hides in plain sight, like the paper in her hand. Hold the camera on the smaller pieces of August that make the larger story possible. A seamstress in Shockoe Bottom stitches a pocket slightly deeper on a dress that will be sold to a house miles away. A carpenter leaves a star under a lintel that will not be examined by anyone who counts himself important. A free black preacher adjusts the order of hymns so that a familiar phrase falls later in the service, pushing a signal down the day to a safer hour. An Irish widow who dislikes questions adds more salt to her soup, so a patrol pauses at her door to drink water and be delayed by thirst. None of these acts will be recorded as heroism. Without them, no hero survives long enough to be recognized. Mid-chapter reveal: the provost's report in March 1861, written in the crisp hand of a man who believes in bureaucracy, names a woman known as Clara, suspected of being a conductor for runaways within the city. The word conductor enters the file like a foreign bird, strange and untranslatable and obviously alive. The report cites sources who cannot be named, which is to say, the House has learned that naming gives people edges they can climb. It recommends sale or confinement, as if those are weather patterns, not violence. Jonathan's appended note complains that since Clara's removal, a spirit has lingered among the domestics. In trying to remove the person, he admits the idea stayed. Step into the fall that follows, because August's held breath does not release into peace. Harper's Ferry happens. The city polarizes. Patrols multiply. Stories harden into us and them. The network, which had been a series of intimacies and errands, becomes a front line made of women buying bread at different stalls than usual. Clara, or the woman the archive lets us call Clara, moves within this tightening net, not as a fugitive only, but as a messenger. Intelligence is a grand word for a small act done very well. Watching where sacks of flour go, counting uniforms drying behind a fence, noting which doors laugh when nearly no one has cause to laugh. She writes with placement, not pen. The portrait taught you to see where she put her hand. The city becomes a larger plate. The emotional center of the chapter must be a choice that hurts even when it is right. The girl from the third door, the one added to the route at cost, makes it to a safe room where a mat replaces a bed and a bowl replaces a promise. Clara has to decide whether to move her north before winter or embed her inside the city where the network is strongest. North is a story that ends in applause. City is a story that rarely ends at all. She chooses the city. The applause belongs to someone else now. The practical mercy is a longer, quieter risk. The girl becomes a runner between two kitchens, a shadow at a churchyard gate, a watcher of candles. In 5 years, no one will know her name unless a ledger writes it by mistake. The ledger will not. The choice stands anyway. Second reveal. In April 1865, Union occupation brings order of a kind and paperwork of a different kind. A refugee camp clerk takes statements from people who have become their own papers. One woman, approximately 40, claims service as a conductor in Richmond during the war, names no names, lists no addresses, and recommends only one carpenter, John Ward, steady and quiet. The clerk notes, credible, discreet, and adds a sentence that has the humility of someone who has learned his categories are too small. Her knowledge appears to have prevented losses. Losses is a military word. Here it means people. The paper signs her contribution in terms the bureaucracy understands. She leaves with less than her due and more than nothing. Turn the lens back on the portrait and deliver the moral shock the series has been building toward. The family paid to fix themselves in time, and what they fixed, more than anything, is the evidence of their own misreading. The picture pretends to be a portrait of control. It is a document of interruption. The interruption did not stop at the frame. It ran a line through August into fall, through sale into return, through rumor into function, through function into war, and out the other side into a camp where the woman, with the steady hand, gave a careful account that kept several houses intact. The hand that looked like a servant's prop became a conductor's instrument. The paper that looked like an accident became a route. The theater that looked like a home became a set she could strike. End with a hook that is also a reckoning. There is one more ledger entry at the very back of Jonathan's book, in a hand that has begun to wobble. It notes, unexplained disappearance of silver spoon service, cost to replace. And below it, almost as an afterthought, door marks persist. Carpenter denies. Will repaint. He is cataloging the persistence of a symbol he cannot scrub. Across the page, in another file, a clerk has written, John Ward deceased. Left tools to apprentice. Shop sign. Removed. Between those two lines lies the fate of a map that outlived the man who paid for the doors it used. The star under the lintel is painted over, then scratched again by a hand that knows where to look. The note in the portrait did not ask for immortality. It asked for use. It got what it asked for. Promise beyond the series, because stories that end at victory scenes are dishonest, unless they also name the cost. The scars on Clara's hands did not fade just because the city changed flags. The habit of watching a door before walking through it does not leave a body quickly. But the map she held did not vanish with her fear. It survives in a photograph a family meant to use as proof that everything was as it should be, and in the quiet skills passed to whoever needed them next. Count 3, move on the 4th. The star is a door. The initials are a chain. The ticks are time. And the hand that looks empty is not.